particularly in that 5 or 6 year period when I was associated with SoftBank, so much happened, right? I mean, there was this complex, larger than life character. This was a period of peak volatility for him in terms of, early days when he was taking off with Alibaba going public, and then the Vision Fund, and then obviously the subsequent come down, some very interesting events in my personal life, losing both my parents, and then this bizarre thing with this smear campaign. A lot of people have made the comment that there's a sense that, Alok, you're kind of in a kind of bewildered state through this entire book, kind of what is going on, what is happening to me. I said, look, I mean, this is a really interesting story. It kind of lends itself to something approaching if not a thriller, certainly a novel with a lot to unpack.
Welcome to another episode of the third season of the Blume podcast. The theme, as all of you know, this year has been winning beyond boundaries. And today we're joined by an incredible example of that across global finance and technology, Alok Sama. Alok Sama is the former president and CFO of SoftBank Group International, chief strategy officer for SoftBank Group when he moved on from there. But while he was there, Alok orchestrated some of tech's largest deals, the $59 billion Sprint and T-Mobile merger, the landmark $34 billion acquisition of Arm by SoftBank. And he was one of Masa Son's closest advisors during that period. And what alerted us to this episode was, of course, Alok's phenomenal tell-all book, The Money Trap. Its subtitle is even more ominous, Lost Illusions Inside the Tech Bubble. We're going to ask Alok what that means. And Alok unpacks like 3 decades of his career, investment banking, VC, across New York, London, Hong Kong. And then, he started with shaping Morgan Stanley's TMT practice in Asia-Pac, and then led to multiple multi-billion-dollar deals at SoftBank. And his journey is very reflective of a masterful understanding of global markets and tech innovation being at the cusp of it. Currently, Alok is a senior advisor to Warburg Pincus. Of course, he continues to influence the intersection of tech and finance like he always has. And today, the idea is to dive a little bit into his experiences, insights, get some lessons from navigating some of these complex deals and sort of extracting a lot of the nuggets from that book. And if you haven't read it, of course, recommend to pick it up at your nearest Amazon or airport or wherever. Welcome to the podcast, Alok. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks, Karthik. I'm looking forward to this.
Super. So I think, Alok, always like to let the audience get to know our guests a little bit. So some amount of background about growing up in Delhi, and then I know you moved and became sort of a global purveyor of finance and a role model for a lot of Indians who want to do that. But a lot of people don't know your dad was a Padma Shri as well for his research on liver diseases, actually. And you were the eldest brother, if I recall right.
Yes.
And so, what did that mean for you? Did they want you to become a doctor? Did they push you in that direction? Very different years in the 70s, 80s in India, right? Everything that we relate to from back then was very stereotypical. And you were in a highly sort of intellectual academic environment. What prompted you to make the choices that pushed you to undergrad in math and then MBA, etc.?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a lot to unpack. Like the first 20 years
give
of
a
my
framework
life.
on who Alok Sama was.
No. I get it. Look, I mean,
Yeah.
for the first 21 years of my life, I barely stepped outside Delhi, and that's not an exaggeration. So that's certainly where my heart is. My father was... my parents met when my father was teaching. He was a lecturer at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and my mother was a medical student. And my early days growing up, it was on the campus of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and you kind of graduated as you went from lecturer to assistant professor. You went from E-type housing to D-type government housing, etc. So it was, from my perspective, it was kind of by Indian standards, it would be middle class, kind of on a modest government salary, but from my perspective, certainly happy days, happy memories. I would describe the environment as intellectual. It was certainly academic, and there's a difference in as much as, my father wasn't watching Satyajit Ray films or reading Rabindranath Tagore. He was just a hands-on scientist, and but certainly that created and if not academic pressure, certainly an academic environment. My mother was a doctor too. She took a break when she had after she had me to have my brother Vivek. But certainly you saw that commitment to academic, to learning, and that was very much part of our Indian ethos anyway. I never felt any pressure to be a doctor, but I think expectation is kind of more the word, particularly a little later in life. When my father broke away from the All India Institute and became a very successful kind of private practitioner, and then later on went on to be chairman of Gangaram Hospital, etc. And so it was more expectation. And when I didn't do it, perhaps my brother felt a little bit more pressure, and he ended up being a doctor. But look, I have happy memories of growing up, and my parents just gave me so much. I just have nothing but gratitude, and nothing but gratitude towards Delhi and towards India. And it's no accident that I've come back and revisited, retouched, kind of touched down on India so many times at Morgan Stanley. One of the things you didn't mention, probably my happiest memory as a banker, was setting up Morgan Stanley's business in India, investment banking business in the mid-90s. And those have always been kind of very, kind of kept me in touch with India in a very meaningful way.
Speaking of India, I think two big influences that you mention in the book as well.
Yeah.
One is a fanboy of Amitabh Bachchan. Second is you love cricket all around. A lot of love for cricket. I know you've traveled far and wide after that. Are those still big loves for you? Does everything Indian pull you back to your roots out of growing up out here? And then, what else about India has fundamentally influenced who you are in a global landscape? I'm just, what is it about you? It's candidly,
it's almost Delhi more than India. I mean, I go to Mumbai, I've been to Bangalore, literally I've been to once, if you can believe, in the last, probably twice actually, in the last, all my life actually, even Mumbai, I was there a few weeks ago, feels like a bit of a foreign country. So to me, India is very much about Delhi, and that's where my roots are. That's where I feel the most rooted. Amitabh Bachchan, Clint Eastwood, growing up. I mean, these were my idols. Not, I wouldn't say they shaped me in a meaningful way, but, perhaps certainly a desire to be, kind of that cool, poker-faced, ironic, that personality I've always found very appealing, very aspirational. It's not what I am, but it certainly made an impression. Cricket, I mean, literally, that's the one sport I don't play, but I follow religiously wherever I am. In terms of watching, I don't play cricket. My first love is golf as a sport to play, but certainly to watch is cricket number one.
And when we talk to entrepreneurs, we try to. It's very difficult to discern in one or two meetings, but like most of us, I think when we make certain choices in life, it's all about figuring out how much of this had to do with their nature versus being like your genetic pool versus how you were nurtured, growing up. And I don't know how mathematics happened for you, and I know you talked about your obsession in your early years about Fermat's last theorem. I know it eventually got solved, but how did that fascination emerge? And then how do these things influence, you as you think through career choices and say, why do I want to become one of the world's best bankers, or, your strategy role in SoftBank? And I'm just trying to, also speak to youngsters who are beginning in their career. Most of our listeners are entrepreneurial, venture-backed sort of company employees or founders. And I'm trying to, they always come for advice on careers and how they're being shaped, post-college.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to sort of, for them to relate to what each one of us has gone through. I think, I know it's been a long time, but would love to sort of do a little bit of flashback and see how do those things, how did they influence you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to unpack, Karthik, and I'm not sure what I'm going to say is going to be useful to anyone, kind of young and aspiring, but I kind of think my life, there's a lot of serendipity, kind of a series of mostly fortunate accidents because, yes, you're right. I studied mathematics, but even that was a bit of an accident. It's actually a really interesting story. In high school, math came easy to me. I was good at, but equally, I used to read obsessively, and my best subject was in parallel could just as well have been English literature, right? But doing something arty was never an option from again, it's a very patriarchal success society. India still is, I guess. But, for a guy to be studying English literature, which is like, how are you going to go out and, kind of studying art? How are you going to go out
Yeah.
and make a living? And going abroad, going to the US at the undergraduate level wasn't an option. My father became, by Indian standards, wealthy later in life, but at that point, it really wasn't an option. And so I applied to St. Stephen's College, and my preferred subject was actually economics, which is the most prestigious course. And
Yeah.
I went into the interview. You mentioned the Amitabh Bachchan influence. And it's kind of comical. I had this ridiculous long flowing hair, kind of coiffed, modeled after Amitabh Bachchan. And Mr. Rajpal, who's the principal of St. Stephen's College, in my interview, I sat down and the first question, St. Stephen's College was unique in that it was the only college that actually interviewed you. I don't know if they still do, but I sat down and the first thing he asked me was in this very kind of, God bless him, may he rest in peace, but, this very pompous, kind of fake, almost English accent, kind of young man, tell me about your hairstyle. Where do you get your hairstyle?
Okay.
and it kind of went downhill from there. And that sort of Amitabh Bachchan, that hairstyle impersonation kind of got me into trouble. And even though my marks were terrific, they were really good, I was rejected. And I'd also applied to mathematics, and my mathematics interview was completely different. They just asked me to solve calculus problems, which I did like, breezily in a heartbeat. and, and so that's how I ended up studying mathematics. And, I was always a problem solver. And yeah, kind of things like Fermat's last theorem, kind of obsessively digging into things like that was something I was really into. And then, by the way, finance was, I don't think I've ever really met anyone. I certainly wasn't one of those people who like aspired to be a banker or wanted to be a banker, let alone the world's greatest banker or whatever. I'd never heard of Morgan Stanley. I had a very peripheral knowledge of what banking was all about anyway, right? Back then, people who had a bent towards finance or commerce kind of wanted to become chartered accountants, right?
That's right.
Or the most aspirational you got was maybe you go work for Citibank one day, right? That was kind of a
Yeah.
big deal at the time. And I described this in the book. It was a pivotal moment in my life. My father introduced me to someone who he believed was a mathematician, and he sort of was. And this gentleman, Dr. Shiv Gupta, turned out to be a professor at the Wharton School. He taught operations research and statistics, and he's the one who's kind of said you should think about. I'd never heard of Wharton. You should think about doing an MBA. And again, he wasn't specifically focused on finance, but he kind of dangled salary numbers like you could be making $40,000-$50,000 a year, which just sounded like an astronomical amount of money. So,
Yeah.
and he really helped out and, kind of told me a little bit about actually the first time I heard of the GMAT was from a friend of mine, someone who most of your listeners, and I'm sure you know, Sanjeev Bikhchandani. He was with me in college and in our batch. He was with me in school too, by the way. He was one of the first people who actually did the GMAT. And he did
Oh,
really well. And I remember Sanjeev telling me, he says, look, you should do this too. And maybe your father can, his parents couldn't afford to send him. He said, maybe your father can afford to kind of pull this together for you. So that's how, kind of he guided me on the GMAT. And
amazing. Yeah.
that's how going to the US came about. And, again, Morgan Stanley was, serendipitous. It was a very waspy firm. At the time, there was, as I recall, only one Indian managing director who I met with, and he took a liking to me, and that's how I ended up at Morgan Stanley and kind of worked my way upwards. So there's not a whole lot you could take away
Yeah.
from that because it really was, and I mean it. It was a series of accidents. And once again, SoftBank. I described this in the book. I mean, I'm on holiday with a good friend, Nikesh Arora, still a very close friend, and he sprang this on me, and he happened to be entering SoftBank in a very senior role where he was supposed to succeed Son, and he asked me to kind of come along for the ride. And that, once again, was not something I was looking for or seeking, and was once again a mostly fortunate accident.
Awesome. No, I think there's a small sort of feels like there's a philosophical lesson in it. What happens in the current world, I speak, is we've reached the other end of the spectrum where I don't think people are mentally sort of preparing themselves to fall into these serendipitous events, and they actually want everything to be more programmatic, right? Because we are now overloaded with information, opportunities. What was a unique set of circumstances that led to this meeting with the professor or these relationships. Today are all being engineered through thousands of counselors trying to send you to the right school. There's income levels which allow you to go to those schools. So basically, what we experienced in the 70s, 80s, 90s, sadly, I think is lost on the current generation.
I think actually, Karthik, you're absolutely right to flag that. And I do, as you might recall, in the book, talk about, in fact, in the epilogue, I talk about in this bizarre incident where I'm meeting with two Mossad spies, two agents. I do talk about, the idea of control being an illusion, which I firmly believe in, because, I think the one thing you can't lose sight of is, a certain level of, don't just step back and hang out on the beach and smoke weed and expect things to happen, right? I mean, it's not that straightforward. There are some people who've been fortunate enough to do that. Maybe if you bought Bitcoin when it was worth pennies and you get lucky, but you can't count on that, right? I mean, a certain level of motivation, a certain level of commitment, and that kind of comes from a family where you see your parents, your family, people around you, your students thriving, working hard, but at a certain level, one of the things that's been incredibly refreshing for me, spending time in India very recently, is this kind of the drive to learn for social mobility is just so powerful in India that you don't ever want to lose that. But beyond that, just appreciate that there's only so much you can control. In fact, there's probably very little you can control.
Great lesson in that. I think I'm going to take a slight deviation, go to the book, and then come back to those, the set of serendipitous events, and maybe one or two fun anecdotes about each one of those eras before we move to the double to click into SoftBank. Is the book like an outcome of all of this love for literature? And I know you went in sort of refreshed yourself with some sort of creative writing inputs from some of the greats in New York. Was it a manifestation of all of those years of unfulfilled desire to actually? I know you read voraciously, but I don't know if you've enjoyed writing and the book came from unmet need over these 30 years or so.
No, I think that's absolutely. I could not have phrased it better. So it really was an unfulfilled ambition. I did want to write, and I did a master's degree, which sounds like a bizarre thing to do, but it was a phenomenal experience for me. I did get a master's degree in creative writing from NYU. At age 58.
How recently, Alok?
There was at age 58. So it was kind of in some respects, kind of a brave thing to do, sort of being in a classroom with a bunch of 28, average age was 28, typically female, very left wing, but it was a kind of a surreal in the nicest possible way experience. But I didn't want to write this specific book. I experimented with many different things, fiction, writing short stories, but kind of what I realized that what I'd been through particularly in that 5 or 6 year period when I was associated with SoftBank, is so much happened, right? I mean, there was this complex, larger than life character, and this was a period of peak volatility for him in terms of, early days when he was taking off again, I should say, with Alibaba going public, and then the Vision Fund, and then obviously the subsequent come down, kind of being part of all of that, witnessing all of that. Some very interesting events in my personal life, losing both my parents. It was, it was a reawakening of sorts. And then this bizarre thing with this smear campaign and thrown into a world where a lot of people have made the comment that there's a sense that, look, you're kind of in a kind of bewildered state through this entire book, kind of what is going on, what is happening to me. And it just, and I'm talking about the smear campaign specifically, the idea that there's so much of an effort, someone spending millions of dollars to get me out of a job that I never really sought in the first place. And I said, look, I mean, this is a really interesting story, and it kind of lends itself to something approaching if not a thriller, certainly a novel with a lot to unpack. So that's how the book came about. Yeah.
I think the 2-3 things again goes back to truth is stranger than fiction. So you said why bother with fiction? There's enough here to sound like it.
Exactly. And the fact that it's all real makes it even makes it all the more interesting.
Amazing. Second is, I think a lot of people have told me first books are almost predominantly autobiographical or a manifestation of self in some way, and this is as autobiographical as it can be. And I think this second wave of Masa and this post GFC wave of what the internet, consumer internet / tech world was going through was sort of a unique phase, and I'm glad the lens on the biggest drama around that, the Vision Fund, somehow gets uncovered. If I may ask you, if it's not outside the realms of confidentiality, did you have to get like a tick mark from SoftBank to sort of proofread this and publish this?
Well, I mean, I certainly, it's you're right to flag this, Karthik. I mean, when you leave in a senior executive role, you sign an NDA, and there's certain degree of accountability that you have. And I was very careful to make sure I went through a very prominent New York lawyer, go through a rigorous legal review. But even beyond the legal review, I think books where, kind of outright tell-alls. I actually don't like it when people describe the book as a tell-all, because that kind of sounds like, it's cheapening the relationship and the respect I have for Masa Son. There's so much I could have said about his private life and his relationships, or with his wife or his daughters or whatever. But I didn't want to go there. That's just
of course not. You respect the relationship too much.
You have to respect. I mean, I was careful to keep the limits in terms of how much I say about his home in Tokyo, his home in California as fair game, because he had hundreds of meetings. That was his office too. So I've been, I had to be careful about navigating that in terms of respecting someone I cared about and respect, his privacy a little bit.
Absolutely.
And so there's certainly an element of that.
Super. Yeah. No, so I think, I'm just going to try and pick on one or two elements of each part of that, longish career.
Yeah.
There was one fun anecdote or episode you seem to have when you were trying to explain derivatives to Dick Cheney back in the 90s. And what was that conversation like? And what is dealing with government or governmental sources at that scale? I mean, you could come up with another anecdote. You probably dealt with dozens of these through your SoftBank days as well. But I find it. I, by the way, chaired the Indian Venture Capital and Alternative Asset Association.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
And I just rolled off that role in March this year, and it was daunting to imagine that the small VC fund take it. But the reason everyone pushed me to the fore is because Indian homegrown venture capital was not represented much. So I said, if I don't take it, then they will say we offered it to you, or we wanted you to take it and you didn't. So I did, and that means ministerial conversations, cabinet secretary conversations, and it's kind of like what you described in a way. But I would love to hear some fun anecdotes on what it feels like in the US, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's I didn't spend too much time on my Morgan Stanley years in the book because you kind of lose focus, if you know what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah, that's right.
There
That's
could
right.
have been so many other incidents. Bizarrely, when President Suharto was overthrown in Indonesia, we were in there in the middle of gunfire, kind of literally the city, Jakarta exploding, pitching a privatization deal. I mean, like really surreal experience. So we had to be a State Department, U.S. State Department, because I happened to be with a bunch of Americans, including the chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. We had to be rescued in the middle of that. Lots of bizarre incidents. Cheney was one of those surreal incidences. He wasn't in government at the time, right? I mean,
Ah,
so he was there as a private citizen. He was on the board of Morgan Stanley, and the reason we ended up talking about derivatives is he was also on the board of Procter and Gamble. And at the time, in the early 90s, kind of derivatives were rocking the world.
yeah.
It's the world. Corporate America was playing with financial derivatives, and Procter and Gamble company in an overzealous attempt to hedge and perhaps manage their earnings had just announced a hefty, I think the number was a couple of $100 million loss. And Dick was on the board, and kind of as a board member, he didn't have accountability, but he'd seen all this happen, and he just he was a recent entrant to Morgan Stanley. He just kind of wanted to unpack in a lot of detail. He's a very smart guy, kind of probing, trying to unpack that. I just thought it was like a surreal conversation. Here I am sitting with Dick Cheney and spending 3 days with him, and he's telling me about, taking out Saddam Hussein. What do you do? Like fire a missile, send a CIA dude to take him out while he's watering his plants. I mean, literally, he's
Yeah.
talking about this in a very matter-of-fact way, and I'm explaining derivatives to him, and we're eating like idlis and dosas and sambar at the hotel. It was truly bizarre.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds surreal indeed. And so, coincidentally, I've been talking about derivatives, by the way. That was my first job in American Express, and
Oh, was it? Yeah.
that's actually where they put me in that division. And strangely enough, it's one of those fields that I think is the only thing that got applied from classroom right into the job, like
Right.
no other thing that I've learned in life. So,
Yeah.
I think I recall this specific incident because it was fresh. My first job was '96, so
Right. Right.
this was a case study, I think, on what can go wrong.
Yeah.
On Nikesh himself, I know he's doing wonderfully as CEO of Palo Alto Networks.
He is. Yeah.
And it seems like a very special relationship, and both of you. So maybe a little bit on what made both of you click, and is it important when you're navigating as a sort of an immigrant into these global markets to have a sort of set of people you can trust like this and bounce things off and use as sounding board, especially if you're trying to rise to the upper echelons. Now, I'm using you as a proxy of someone who's risen to the top of the sort of stack in global organizations, which is now everybody reads about them, and so many Indians are doing well, and we haven't had someone like that on a podcast. So I'm deliberately double clicking on what does it take for you to sort of imbibe both networks, lean on people like Nikesh, and then grow together as peers in a foreign country initially. Of course, now you get naturalized, but it's easier on the kids who are naturalized by birth. But how are immigrants like you cracking it, in global markets?
Yeah, so the point about networks actually is really, really important because, as I don't specifically touch on that, but I think I alluded to this in the discussion we had in terms of significant events in my life. How did I end up at the Wharton School? Well, it was an Indian immigrant professor at the Wharton School. How did I end up at Morgan Stanley? Yet another Indian immigrant managing director, Bengali gentleman, Bidyat Sen was his name. God bless him, still out there. And then, how did I end up at SoftBank? But that was my relationship primarily with Nikesh. And I think how did we connect? Now, initially, and I described my first meeting with Nikesh, the first point of connection is actually the fact that both of us from Delhi. Now, Nikesh's father was in the Air Force, so he'd moved around quite a bit. In my case, it was exclusively Delhi, but still, he'd finished his schooling in Delhi. That was a point of connection. And Delhi is now his wife is also from Delhi, so you're very strong nexus. So we had that in common. And then with Nikesh, it was also a case of he is, and I don't say this lightly, analytically, his ability to process, he's in a league by himself. Never seen anything like it. And I'm coming from a position where I've worked with closely with really, really smart people. It was one of those dynamics where if you're in a room with him and you're keeping pace with him, you can kind of give yourself a pat on the back. And strangely enough, there were Nick and Nikesh himself, I think, would concede this, that there were times when I not only kept pace with him, but once in a while I would actually be a step ahead of him. And for his part, I'd like to think he thought that was pretty cool too. So that was a pretty fundamental piece of fundamental reason why we got along. And that was a lot of where our connection came from.
So I think what I'm going to do now is switch gears, Alok, to obviously the meat of the book itself and the bulk of your last long gig in life, which is of course SoftBank.
SoftBank, yeah,
and the mercurial Masa Son behind that brand. You spoke of like multiple mega deals that you were a part of, right? And what is the difference between those early days at, let's say, of course you've done mega deals even through Morgan Stanley, but what makes mega deals happen? Is it about just classic capitalism incentives, or is it about people? Is it about egos? People make it seem as if, M&As, for example, in venture, we think about, one exit option is M&A. And it's just thrown out there, literally out there, as if, somebody can just go and get an M&A done. And from a founder perspective, from an investor perspective, have you sort of observed when these happen? Why do they happen? What's the magic behind?
Yeah, there's no magic. Karthik, this is standard MBA curriculum. There's courses in M&A and why deals happen and horizontal mergers and vertical mergers and all of that stuff. And you look at the deals that I've been involved in. In my stint at SoftBank, the Sprint and T-Mobile merger, it was a case of two companies needed to get together to create a viable competitor. It was literally as simple as that. Very big on synergies, right? That was a big part of the value driver because the savings on overheads, network costs, marketing costs, distribution, stores, monumental numbers, and those synergies are still unfolding. So that's one kind of merger, right? It's consolidation in an industry where there's too much competition. And to be viable, there needs to be consolidation. Then the other big deal in my SoftBank days, completely different kind of deal, no synergies whatsoever. That's a uniquely Masa Son deal. That deal was a giant bet on technology and a vision of the future. This company, the way it is, even though it's expensively valued, even though I have to pay a hefty premium to acquire control, I think the world will unfold in a different way, and I can tweak and even transform this business model to create value, right? And that's a really bold deal to do because you pay this hefty premium, the market doesn't get it, or the market doesn't believe it, right? And when we did that deal, when SoftBank did that deal, it's one of those kind of rare cases where markets are perfectly efficient, right? So we paid this hefty premium above market value, and the market value of SoftBank declined by the exact amount of that premium. Those deals are really, really difficult to justify, particularly in the context of a public company. So look, I mean, different kinds of deals. Deals happen for very different reasons. Companies want to become conglomerates, diversify. That's usually not a great reason. One, kind of seeking growth, deploying excess cash flow. Those are not the best kind of deals to do. The best kind of deals are actually along the lines of T-Mobile and Sprint, where there's strategic necessity. There's tons of room to create value because there's lots of synergies. There's complementarity. Sprint had a ton of spectrum. T-Mobile had an amazing marketing team. They did marketing-oriented management team, I should say. They built a band which was terrific, very popular among millennials. So lots of synergies, lots of complementarity. Those kinds of deals are very different, unique, rare win-wins. Deals like Arm are very tough to pull out. The onus is completely on you to actually go in there and justify, and God bless Masa Son. I mean, how he's pulled that off is mind-blowing.
Yeah. No, I think, again, valuable lessons, even though they're at maybe 100th the scale of what you folks were doing. Just this Monday, we were on a call with the board around such an opportunity. And you're absolutely right. I think all sides need to understand every dimension of why you would even attempt an M&A. And I think you sort of adeptly walked us through at least a couple of examples from a 30,000 foot view. So thanks for that. And then, of course, the man behind it and these one-off crazy bets. Let's shift gears to Masa Son.
By the way, just coming back to, I mean, I do want to kind of, I think not necessarily a lot of the deals I was involved in, but I think in the world of technology, this notion of should I sell, shouldn't I sell is actually a really interesting one to unpack, right? I mean, it is, the history as well as I do. You look at the number of times the Mark Zuckerberg, potentially had the opportunity to sell out, and he didn't. He held out, and you look at some of the deals he did, even when they seemed outrageous. WhatsApp is the ultimate example. $19 billion for WhatsApp. What is the guy thinking, right? I mean, it turned out to be a phenomenal deal. So that
Insta even better probably at $1 billion.
Yes, exactly. Insta even better, right? I mean, brilliant in terms of predicting, hedging its future in terms of where social networks were headed, which is visual, mobile, kind of, you got to make judgments about how habits will evolve, how networks will evolve, right? So bold strategic deals, but equally kind of that self-belief that no, kind of $1 billion is not enough. $2 billion is not enough. I think I'm onto something and it's huge. Or spending $19 billion I can justify because what I'm after is worth $1 trillion.
Yeah. No, that and I think the self-belief that you can arguably and almost always perhaps build it even much better than who's going to acquire it, right? Because I think there's a founder, I mean, of course, there's, the whole blog about founder mode and manager mode.
Yeah.
But apart from that distinction, I think as long as the vision, you can stretch the vision much further, it probably belongs with you. But founders go through these like real lows where they do contemplate that. Elon probably sold or tried to sell every one of his businesses and came very close, probably within 10 or 20% of deal value. And, the planet might have been different for the kind of decisions he would have made if Google had bought him up.
But, the founders too, in my experience, the huge, Masa is a great example, call it this crazy factor, which is a big thing he looks for, that kind of consummate hunter living in the future mentality. And if you look at the greats out there, and I put Elon Musk in there, they have that quality. That's really, really rare.
Yeah. No, and he himself is a little bit of that. So I think he definitely doesn't want to bet
Of course he is. Of course he is.
Who doesn't manifest that is not meeting the bar.
Absolutely. And when he sees that in someone like Bhavish, for example, a little bit of that, and he goes all in.
Yeah, and you obviously take us back to a little bit of his story as a kid and sort of influencing even his dad's decisions with some insights, commonsensical insights very early the freemium model,
Exactly.
way back to
The coffee
all
shop.
the way
It's an
back to
amazing story, isn't it?
yeah, it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
But apart from that, anecdotally or otherwise, what do you think makes Masa Masa? Right? Why aren't there more Masas out there?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a bit of a cliched interpretation, but adversity and being being Korean in Japan is, I don't know, the Indian closest would be, I guess, I'd like to think things are a lot better, but being kind of at the absolute bottom end of the caste system, being an untouchable. I mean, it was that ugly, right? There was only so much you could do until what kind of job you could get, kind of your status, you couldn't vote. It was really, really nasty in every way. And I have to believe that made an impact. And he saw his father's struggles as an entrepreneur. And once again, the resilience, for example, his father, what he had to go through and constantly reinvent himself. I talk a little bit about the evolution of his business model and, being thoughtful, being resilient. So a lot of that, I think, came from his father and from his early roots. But, that crazy factor, the ability to kind of see the future, that's unique. I don't know where he got that from. That did not come from his father. And that to me is a wow. I don't think anyone can learn that.
Yeah.
It's just not a legitimate aspiration.
I know, and the recent Jensen Huang video is hilarious, right? Where Jensen first tells the whole audience that this man has pretty much called every decade-long evolution of generation.
And I make that point in my book. So if it was a one-off thing, okay, he got lucky. And when people talk about Masa Son, one-hit wonder, Alibaba, bullshit, right? I mean, it is. You look at, he's called them. You talk about the PC revolution, the origins of the company, distributor of Microsoft software in Japan. Call that mobile, the internet, right? Call that, became the richest man in the world. Call that. Now, he's not a trader. He didn't cash out at the top of the market, but he certainly got the technology trend right? Likewise, when it comes to mobile phones, smartphones taking over the world, he called that, right? AI, he was talking about that 10 years ago.
Even his misses are things that he called, actually. So he came close to doing the deal with Facebook. He obviously bought into NVIDIA, probably sold it a little early, and that's when he puts his head on Jensen's shoulder.
Yeah, look, NVIDIA is interesting. Look, I mean, I was there at the time. We did the numbers. I ran the numbers and, kind of even made judgments as to if you had to buy NVIDIA. I mean, don't buy. I'm not talking about buying the stock. I'm talking about buying the company. With a controlled premium, it would have cost us $83 billion. I just vividly remember that number. And talking to Masa and basically saying, Son, absolutely, let's go for it. This makes so much sense. Because this was Masa at his best, right? Calling a technology trend and saying, okay, the stock's expensive, but market doesn't get how big this is going to become. But again, the obstacle there was, no way CFIUS, kind of the idea of CFIUS being the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States would allow a foreigner, even though it's a benign kind of Japanese foreigner, to take control of an asset like NVIDIA. So you end up buying a public stake, less than 5%. And since it was a 5% stake, public stake, bought on a leverage basis and bought in a fund which was itself levered. When you make 4 or 5 times your money, the impulse is always going to be like, okay, let's just cash. You know exactly what I'm talking about. There's an accountability to your LPs. You can't just tell them. It takes a lot of courage to tell them, you know what, even though I'm up 4 or 5% and I could cash in today and send the cash to you, I'm going to sit on it for another 10 years. That does not happen in a fund context. Now, a lot of people in your business are now kind of going through that and creating these different funds, longer term, etc. It's a very interesting dynamic being in a venture fund. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm just curious about your personal view. You're like, I look at a lot of the analogies you made towards some of these things are not really tech businesses. They're internet-enabled traditional business models. You should apply similar multiples to them. And, now when you are out of a step removed from all that mayhem for 10 years, where have you landed in the sense that on 2 fronts? One is I know that belief we share, and I agree with you. That's how business model should be sort of evaluated. But when it comes to tech itself, apart from ideas that Masa might have instilled in you, like singularity and how you chase those kind of goals, what do you think of tech going forward? What do you see as the future? What excites you as both an investor and an observer of technology? And just the discussion we completed, if you had to advocate something, would you be one of those perpetuity vehicle folks who say you should never let go of like really long-term directional trends for maybe not perpetuity literally, but 15, 20 years, as opposed to trying to flip them around for 5 to 7 year cycles?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd be in all humility, I will tell you, I mean, I've never been the one to get these big long-term bets right. I should have bought NVIDIA. Now, when I was at SoftBank, I obviously couldn't because we were looking at buying the company. It would have been completely inappropriate. But, every time I've looked at it, it's become too expensive now. And kind of kicked myself every year on a regular basis since when I've been completely unrestricted to buy. So it's really, really tough to get these bets right. And I certainly have not got this right. But coming to your point about, or your question about technology, I don't have a terribly original answer other than to say that when it comes to AI, I am a believer, certainly as a productivity tool at the enterprise level. It is nothing short of transformational, probably as big as the internet. You go back to that old line, every company is an internet company. In that sense, every company is an AI company. And I mean that from the perspective of, and by the way, that's a reason to be bullish on stocks generally, because leveraging AI, AI can be expensive, the costs associated with it, but those are going to come down in terms of processing energy as more supply comes online. At some point, there may well be too much supply, just as there was with the telecom build out. But to deploy AI as a productivity tool and as a potential for margin expansion is a good reason to be bullish on enterprises across the board. Now, what does that mean in terms of investable propositions? It's not that straightforward. We talked about my friend Sanjeev. His team, InfoEdge, introduced me to this company called Gyani, which is doing some interesting stuff in terms of voice-based AI platform that originates, collects loans. There's a lot of, and then that on a fee basis, that's a platform that's used by people in the financial services business, but over time, those companies, financial services companies, they're all going to have that capability. Maybe there's companies that create enterprise-focused business models that become really profitable. I think there is that opportunity. Yeah. Jury's out as to what happens at the individual level, at the consumer level, right? I haven't seen evidence of compelling business models, kind of what happened with Web 2.0 when you had 4 5G networks and then models like Uber, etc. That social media generally, evolving forms of social media. It's just not obvious what that's going to be, but you got to watch that space. I think there'll be some interesting opportunities there as well.
And the second part, like if you were advising us as I know I don't control, like you said, we're not much in control of our. We have to talk to our LPs, convince them, sell this vision. Even a Masa couldn't sell the vision, of course, albeit at a different scale, to people around the world that the Vision Fund should meet a certain set of objectives. But, is this I know you talked about the time machine strategy of Masa. Like, if you can double click on that for the audience. And is this what he means by, being able to play the long game? And as a fund manager, is that what I should aspire to sort of devise a strategy which allows me to hold these really, like almost the strategy itself should be like akin to this time machine strategy? Or am I confusing it?
Yeah, let's unpack the time machine strategy because I think we're talking about two different things. One, you're talking about kind of the actual fund strategy that gets into your obligations to your LPs. And, at the end of the day, your business model, you have a customer-client relationship. Your client is your LP. And if the LP's horizon is, okay, there needs to be a J curve and I'm investing with a certain set of expectations as to when I'm expecting money back. That's what you sign up to. That's what you got to deliver on, right? So, it is, again, we touched on this in terms of permanent capital vehicles, longer term vehicles that you could create. But until you have that, you're locked into that model. That's what, for better or worse, that's what you signed up for. You're stuck with it, right? You could distribute stock to investors and they could do what they want with it if a company goes public, which is what VCs do in the United States. The time machine strategy is very different and it's very straightforward and incredibly powerful in India and incredibly powerful certainly in my lifetime, probably in yours and most people listening, right? And what Masa is talking about is something, or was talking about, it's very straightforward. No magic in there. It's not like kind of Einsteinian, time travel or whatever. It's as simple as you look at disruptive models that have worked, in whether it's transportation or fintech, and you transport them to emerging markets like India, and with modest tweaks, it should work. And I've argued, Masa's argued, and I think it's absolutely spot on that when you don't have legacy infrastructure, retail in India is a great example, right? You have a transition, ongoing macro trend that's going to continue in the US, which is less of the shopping mall culture, more of shopping online. That's where the world is moving, right? Even the AI models, kind of moving towards, kind of a e-commerce capability. That's where the world is moving. In India, you never had that shopping mall culture. I mean, a handful of shopping malls, maybe Delhi, Mumbai, other places, but so there's nothing to disrupt, right? You don't have that much of a public transportation infrastructure in most Indian cities. They're trying to build it out, but the need for kind of Uber-like alternative, it's natural, right? I mean, there's even more of an argument for a Bhavish to do what he's doing with electric cars, electric scooters, or whatever. So that is a secular trend that's there to stay for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And if all you did in India, don't get too funky about deep tech or new technologies or biotech, which are inherently very, very risky. These are all, as long as you're getting in with the right set of entrepreneurs at sensible valuations, you just got to ride that.
Awesome. No, since you brought them up, and I was going to cut over from Masa as an individual to what he enabled for the Indian ecosystem. I mean, he was probably the boldest investor.
Yes.
Other than Tiger set it off, but I think he layered.
Well, Tiger kind of jumped on the bandwagon much later. I think Tiger was, I think, more kind of 21 globally. Kind of they got into that spray and pray mode.
Small disagreement because I wrote in my first year, I wrote like a quarterly. One of our quarterly updates was actually a tribute to Leaf Excel.
Oh, is that right? But this is true. Well, Lee was a plan. Okay, well, I got a lot of time for Lee. I did spend some time with Lee.
But you're absolutely right. I remember this conversation. There's a funky anecdote.
He wasn't throwing money on the same scale as Masa, but you're absolutely
not
right.
Even remotely. So this is the anecdote, if
Yeah.
Lee ever listens to this episode.
Yeah.
So I'm on the phone with Lee, or I'm meeting him in New York.
Yeah.
And this is the month where Masa has cut both the checks into Snapdeal and Ola.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Lee says, this guy just wrote more money in this month than I've written for the last 8 years in India.
There you go.
Right? And so he's like, what do I make of this? And then he's like, obviously I need to ally with him. And of course, Lee tried that with even Flipkart being brought into Masa's table.
So I was bang in the middle of that. So I was working with Lee, with Kunal and Rohit, trying to engineer that, persuade the Snapdeal team to come along for the ride. God bless them. I mean, they could have walked away with that, promised them a gave them a really, really sweet deal in terms of money they
Yeah.
could take it out. But they went in and they've been, it's great to see them be as successful as they have. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it was, Lee recognized that you needed to have that Masa capital cannon behind Flipkart. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've seen tons of founders in different parts of the world and the very best in the US. And you've now obviously run, I mean, Adam Newman is a different camp altogether on that spectrum. But even when it comes to Bhavish and the whole ton of folks SoftBank backed in India, compared to global entrepreneurs, do you see us having an edge, or there are certain areas that we need to work on, number one? And I know you took a break from that and came back this year and spent a bunch of time. I don't know if you had a chance to engage with a lot of entrepreneurs. And what do you think has changed in these 5-7 years? Are we same time machine strategy? Are we taking our entrepreneurial cohort itself and taking them to a different level in India, or do you believe there's still time to do that?
No, I think it's the same set of factors, and I mean that as a positive, not as a put down, because I just think that you don't even need to disrupt. You've got that digital transform. It's not even a transformation. It's growth, and it's growth powered increasingly by technology in a growing economy. It's just such an extraordinary macro trend. You've got a government that, at a minimum, is not in your way. You've got a global VC system that is behind India, collateral beneficiary of people being disillusioned with China and its kind of flirtations, going a little bit backward in terms of even fundamentally kind of promoting, capitalist type, a growth model, right? I mean, you saw what happened with Jack Ma's, made a lot of people really wary. Saw what happened with Didi. So India's been a beneficiary of that. I tell you what, I was really blown away by. This is getting off piece, and it goes beyond just technology. And I talked to this about a number of people, and this is more related to the reception to the book, and I think actually is India's greatest strength and something to be proud of, which is this obsession with gyan, knowledge, in every form. I've seen that thrown at me in ways that just blown my mind. It's like every word I write, people want to understand. What did you mean by that? I've heard someone say this, but I've never heard someone say it like this. Can you please explain what that means? Just a very sincere desire for self-improvement, for social mobility. It's extraordinary. I don't see that in the US. I don't see that anywhere, to be quite honest. It's very, very cool.
And actually, there's an interesting follow-on question to that, and maybe I don't know what chances you give us, but as a country, but for the very first time, other than IT services and manufacturing, traditional industries where Indians have actually transcended borders and built for global markets, we're beginning to see that kind of courage come into even things like consumer internet and SaaS, of course, software, and even hardware, for example. So we have some in our portfolio. I have a request to you as well on this ultra-human ethereal machines, gray orange, etc. And do you think they have a chance? Like, what would your odds that you would give on us building phenomenal global companies from here? Which even China has done a few, but like in this generation of the post-internet world. But is it possible for India to actually win on that count as well? You think?
Well, you got. I mean, I kind of question the legitimacy of that question, which is, do you want to be global just for the sake of being global? Because you're dealing with India itself is a giant market, right? If you want to make one advantage you do have if you've grown up in India is you are operating in one of the most cost-sensitive markets in the world. The Indian consumer is the most cost-sensitive. So if you found a way to make money, you should be able to transport that elsewhere, right? One of the entrepreneurs, different generation, who I'm quite close to, and I've had a mentoring relationship with him, him mentoring me, is Sunil Mehta, right? I mean, and Bharti is a classic case of you operating in India where your ARPUs are a fraction of ARPUs in
That's correct.
your revenue
Probably lowest
of
ARPUs.
China, lower than Africa, right? I mean,
Yeah.
think about that. It's mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
And they've been profitable and phenomenally successful.
Yeah.
And there are a number of things that they did that were pioneering in terms of what they did with their network, the early relationships with Ericsson, and how you can take some of that knowledge and transport that to the Western world. When you looked at BT, for example, I very strongly encouraged him to do that. Now, he doesn't have a controlling interest there, but I would wager that if exactly as this happened with the Tatas and with the steel and the auto industry in the UK, if Sunil was running BT, it would be a better, probably more profitable company. So there's certainly room to do that in terms of transporting kind of management skills honed in India to the Western world. Technology, you've got to come up with, I'm trying to think of models, emerging market models. TikTok is a great example.
Yeah.
But TikTok is that rare case of a company, and Son, to his credit, was very early in identifying the addictive power of the AI algorithms that TikTok use. That's their secret sauce, right?
That's correct.
They kind of get inside your head, wormed inside your brain, and they get you hooked. Right? It's not particularly healthy, but from a commercial perspective, they did that. And if you want to go global in the world of technology, that's a very high bar to come up with something like that. I haven't seen evidence of that in India, but I'd be I'd be willing to be surprised in the most positive way if that happens. I just haven't seen that.
I wish for it to happen as well. I agree with you. I agree with you. It's not a proven thing at all. I think there are a lot of people like humming into that zone, but it's a very big ask. I know we touched a lot about your views on where you think tech is going. We're up on the hour, so want to maybe move to a little bit of rapid fire questions, but a couple of questions around your new avatar. So what's keeping you excited nowadays? What's the Warburg role, likely to look like for the next half a decade to a decade? And by the way, coincidentally, bizarrely, I ran into both Dan and, of course, we know Vishal in India. And so essentially, we know half of like the Warburg leadership summit. Dan and me went to business school together.
Oh, is that right?
I ran into him after all these years in Singapore at some event this year, and it's like, Dan told me his story was fascinating. So, all folks I happen to coincidentally know. But
no, I mean, look, those guys are, my relationship goes back to Chip K. We were together in Hong Kong for a while, and I've gotten to know the Mark Kolodny, who's now co-heads the US business and heads the global technology business. My issue with them, and when I say issue, I mean this as a compliment to them, is those guys are just so damn good when it comes to domain expertise that I find myself adding no value at all. So I love the association, but candidly, it ends up being a case of purely from a selfish perspective, me learning from them, and I try and contribute when I can. So
being very humble.
But seriously, I mean, they're just absolutely terrific, and their track record in investing in technology is absolutely awesome. And I don't just mean India. Vishal, Viraj, the whole team on the ground in India, they're terrific people, and the global team is absolute top notch too. So I mean, I like that association, but from my perspective, I'm also associated with a small VC fund. It's only 70 million, but they've done, God bless them, couple of young men, interestingly, both of Indian origin, out of New York and LA, and they've done spectacularly well, Valhalla Ventures. And they're doing some off-the-wall stuff in the world of deep tech, ranging from psychedelics, kind of LSD, separating it out into the two kind of components that into the, the separating out the therapeutic component, which is proven to have benefits for schizophrenia, PTSD, ranging from deals like that to biometric guns. Americans are going to use guns anyway, so why not have biometric identification with guns? And another deal in the satellite space. So really interesting, deep depth, kind of off the wall kind of deals. I do enjoy that interaction too. But for me, I really do want to write more.
Awesome.
Invested 2 years in that master's degree with the intention of writing. And once I'm basically kind of done with the phase where you've written the book and you've got to invest in marketing it, and have an obligation to the publisher to do that. Now it's like really sinking my teeth into the next writing project, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Amazing. No, I'm not saying this just to get you chuffed, but like after the Phil Knight book on Nike, I think this was one of the most enjoyable books I read in a long
Yeah,
time.
thank you. Thank you.
And so before I let you go, I'm just going to like quickly fire some rapid fire at you.
Oh my God. Okay.
amongst all of these, myriad deals over these 30 plus years, most challenging deal, and what did it teach you?
It's got to be Sprint T-Mobile, because it was not just, I was in a quasi principal role. I wasn't just advising someone. There's a lot at stake. It was kind of almost existential in terms of that albatross hanging over Masa's head to deal with that company. And what it taught me at the end of the day, deals are all about figuring out what's crucially important to you. What are you willing to compromise on? What is the other side willing to compromise on? And once you know what the hot buttons are, you can never approach a complete win-win, but you can at least get to a point where both sides kind of get a piece of what's really, really important, and what they've compromised on is what's sort of less important to them. That's always the key in any negotiations. You just kind of reinforce that, and very happy to have brought that to a close, and it's been obviously phenomenal for SoftBank.
Awesome. And I know mentors leave a little bit of them with you whenever you've had a long stint, but best piece of advice of Masa's that stayed with you?
In the world of technology, nothing he does I can never emulate. But one piece of advice I practice, I really take to heart, is after you're 50, every time you pass a restroom, you just do it.
That's amazing. It's really funny. Sounds so Masa. A technology trend that you wish you'd bet on a little earlier.
Oh man, I mean, ironic, but buying NVIDIA AI. I mean, I'm sitting by. It's just so ironic. I'm sitting by Masa's side. I see it. I believe in it. I still don't pull the trigger.
Funny. One place in the world, given how chaotic, crazy your life has been in terms of where all you move, where you truly feel like this is home.
Oh, Delhi, always.
Oh, wonderful to hear that.
Yeah.
And is that coincidentally, as you know, I'm sitting there today.
Yeah.
And a book that you go back to often? Do you reread books?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite writers, big influence, Nabokov, he had this line: "You never read a book, you only read it," which I really believe in. But a book that has really influenced me, it's not an easy read, absolutely fascinating read. It's not a long read, is the German writer called W.G. Winfried Siebold, and the book is called Rings of Saturn. I think it's a real tribute to intellectual curiosity. I mean, I read that, I reread that, and there's just new depths to it. It's just really, really an amazing journey of the mind. And by the way, the number one quality I look for when I interview people, and a lot of people in the investment business agree with that, I don't know if you do, is the number one standout quality is kind of smarts, etc. You almost take for granted. Motivation is intellectual curiosity. And that book really is a tribute to intellectual. Wherever you are, whatever you see, try and figure out what's behind this, what's the story behind this.
Doubly so in venture capital, right? Because you're trying to rewrite our business models altogether, right? So anything conventional is almost out of the window. Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And your favorite restaurant?
It's actually a neighborhood restaurant in London. It's called Yashin Sushi. It is just terrific food, nothing fancy, and it's the best value for money meal anywhere in the world, including India.
Check it out next time. It's called Yashin Sushi?
Yashin, yeah.
Okay, Yashin Sushi, okay. And finally, golf or cricket?
To play golf, to watch cricket.
I thought as much. I was expecting that. Again, Alok, you've been a fantastic guest.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.
And taking all of the questions. And we wish you luck in this new gig at Warburg. We'd love to read your new books whenever they're out. And wish you more luck on that front. And hopefully we'll catch up in person soon.
No, likewise. I mean, it's amazing what you're doing. And, in many ways, I'm envious. It's just a great, great time to be an investor in India. So let's stay in touch, and I'd love to find ways to be helpful.
Thanks, Alok.
We thank IDFC First Bank for being our annual partner. IDFC First Bank is deeply engaged with the startup community in India. Their commitment to fostering innovation and supporting entrepreneurship has made them a valuable partner in the growth journey of numerous startups, including many Blume portfolio companies. This partnership helps us in a mission to back the next generation of revolutionary founders in India.